Two true stories. Two lives forever changed. Two pieces of evidence that could undermine everything we know about the supernatural. Join us as we explore the terrifying truth about the woman with goat legs. Be part of our creepy family. Subscribe and join the discussion in the comments. Your opinion matters to us. We were driving home late one night after a weekend at Grandma's place in a small town on the edge of Texas. Our old Ford was bumping along the winding, dimly lit road through Pine Hollow. That part of the road was known as the loneliest in the whole area. Miles and miles of nothing but thick pine trees and darkness. "This is the creepiest road in the state," Mom said from the front seat, buckling her seatbelt as she glanced out the window. Dad was driving, quiet and focused on the road. I sat in the back, trying to get comfortable between bags of groceries and Grandma's gifts. I've always hated this road. It wasn't just the silence, it was the stories. People whispered about the girl of Pine Hollow, the ghost of a young woman who supposedly appears on the side of the road, seeking help from passers-by. Legend has it she was an orphan, who tragically perished on this very road nearly 50 years ago. Many claim to have seen her, long blonde hair and a black coat dragging on the ground. Some even said there was something wrong with her walk, that her legs weren't quite human. "Pine Hollow is starting to feel like a horror movie," I muttered, and Mom nodded silently. Just then, the headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road. "Wait, is that someone?" Mom exclaimed. Dad slowed down, the engine humming as the car lost speed. I felt my stomach clench. Leaning forward, I was driven by curiosity and a strange sense of dread. The headlights finally illuminated her clearly enough for me to see. She was a young woman. Her blonde hair was disheveled, as if she'd been walking against the wind for hours. She wore a long, black coat, too big for her frame, that nearly touched the ground. The coat was dirty and torn in a few places, as if she'd been through a thorny bush. She walked slowly, barely lifting her feet, but what caught my attention was her gait. It was wrong, as if her knees were bent backward, or her feet were striking the ground in an unnatural way. My heart raced. I didn't know why, but every step she took seemed almost inhuman. The lights briefly illuminated her face. Though she was far away, I could swear her face was pale and rigid, with an expression I couldn't decipher, neither fear, pain, nor anger. "Looks like she needs help," Mom said, but her voice lacked confidence. At that moment, the wind picked up, whistling through the half-open window. It carried the scent of earth, damp and cold, but also something else, a faint hint of decay. "What do you think happened to her?" I whispered, as Dad's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know," he replied, leaning forward. "But she doesn't look good." His voice was low, almost as if he didn't want her to hear him. Dad slowly stopped the car, the headlights still illuminating the girl. She stood by the road, her head bowed, as if she hadn't noticed us stopping. Mom sighed, unbuckled her seatbelt, and started to roll down the window. "Excuse me, do you need help?" she called out, but the girl didn't respond. There was no answer. The girl still stood turned away from us, and something about her posture seemed wrong, unnaturally stiff. Mom opened the door, clearly determined to approach her. "Maybe she's hurt," she said, more to herself than to us. I can't just leave her here. As soon as she stepped out, I felt a wave of cold, even though the windows were closed. I shivered as the wind picked up. Mom leaned towards the girl and tried again. "Hey, are you okay?" At that moment, the girl turned her head. I can't explain what I saw. Her face wasn't quite human. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the headlights' glow, and her eyes, dark and deep, were devoid of any life. It was as if they were dead. But the worst was what I noticed when she turned towards Mom. Her mouth was twisted into a smile that didn't express joy. It was the smile of a predator. "Get back!" I shouted, unconsciously gripping the seat. But it was too late. Before Mom could react, the girl took a step towards her. The sound was unmistakable and horrifying. The thud of hooves on asphalt. Mom stumbled backward as the girl turned fully towards her. Her coat was shifted, and I saw what I didn't want to see. Her legs weren't human. They were thin, hairy, with bent joints and hooves instead of feet. "Drive!" Mom yelled, frantically grabbing the door and trying to get back into the car. Dad was already ready. He pressed the gas pedal, and the tires screeched as we sped away. As we drove away, I looked through the rear window. The girl stood in the middle of the road, staring at us. She wasn't chasing us. She wasn't trying to move. She just stared, smiling in a way I'll never forget. Nobody in the car said a word. The wind was still howling outside, but inside, it was dead quiet. All I could hear was Mom breathing like she just ran a marathon, clutching the seat like it was gonna fly away. Dad was gripping the wheel so tight, his knuckles were turning white. He was driving way too fast, headlights slicing through the dark road ahead. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, even though I wasn't really expecting an answer. "I don't know," Dad said, short and to the point, but his voice? Totally different. I'd never heard him sound so freaked out before. Mom stayed quiet. She looked like she was shaking, but when I looked at her, I saw her hands pressed against her chest, trying to stop the blood. "She hit me," she whispered. Her hoof hit me right in the chest. Panic started building up in me. "We need to get to the hospital, now," I shouted, but Mom just shook her head. "No, drive home," she said, her voice way too calm, like it was nothing. "Just drive." We got home way too fast. Dad barely stopped the car before jumping out to help Mom. I bolted inside, not even looking back at the dark road behind us. But I could feel her eyes on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound, every gust of wind made me jump. I swear, I could feel her out there, waiting. Mom got better, but she never wanted to talk about that night. Dad just said it was some random girl, probably on drugs, but I didn't buy it. His words were empty, forced. Months later, I found stories online about people who'd had similar encounters. They talked about a woman in a black coat, with blue hair and a creepy, blood-freezing walk. Some said they'd seen her on the same road. Others mentioned her smile. The kind of smile you never forget. And I still dream about her. Every night, in my dreams, she's standing by my window, tapping her hooves on the concrete. I know she's waiting. I live in this tiny town called Pinewood, right by the mountains in North Carolina. Everything seemed super chill, but there were always these rumors about weird stuff happening around here. In Pinewood, though, silence never really felt like just silence. It was one of those cold October afternoons, and I was heading home after a long day at work. It was raining, but it wasn't too dark 'cause the streetlights were fighting with the clouds. I was walking through this narrow, empty alley toward my house at the end of the street. I remember getting that feeling, you know, like I wasn't alone. It was late, no one was around, the streetlights were flickering out, and the only sound was the crunch of my footsteps on the wet path. But then there were those other footsteps. I tried to ignore it, picked up my pace, but I could feel them. Two women. They were way behind me, but their footsteps got louder and closer. They were wearing long black coats and these big hats, like creepy twins following me, moving without making a sound. I was freaking out. My legs started moving faster, and my hands went cold, like they were shaking on their own. Looking down at the ground, I barely noticed the rain had stopped for a sec, but the chill? That wasn't going anywhere. I could still feel them. They were close. I reached my gate. My heart was in my throat. I turned around, hoping I was just imagining it, but no. There they were, standing in the edge of the light, staring at me. And that's when I saw it. Their legs, they weren't human. I could see hooves. I froze, my stomach dropped. The fear hit me like a wave, and it was so intense I thought I might pass out. I slammed the gate shut, rushed into the yard, and banged the door behind me. They didn't come after me, but they weren't far either. It felt like they were just there, watching me. Maybe they'd been following me. Maybe they were death. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was a mess, and the image of those women in black coats with hooves kept replaying over and over. I imagined them standing outside my window, waiting, like they wanted something from me. My heart felt heavy, flooded with something I couldn't explain. All I knew was that they weren't normal women. I woke up around 3 a.m., when the night was at its quietest. The rain was still falling, and the wind was carrying a moan through the trees in the yard. I had this urge to go to the window and look. Maybe they were gone. Maybe it was all just in my head, something my fear had created. When I looked out the window, my heart stopped. They were there, standing at the edge of my yard, exactly where I had last seen them. They stared at my window, as if they knew I was watching them. They didn't move, but I could feel them, like they were right there, present with me at every second. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I slowly opened the terrace door and stepped outside. My legs moved almost on their own as fear tightened around my stomach. I didn't speak to them, didn't want to provoke them. I just stood there, knowing they weren't there by accident. They were part of something bigger, something darker. Suddenly, one of the women raised her hand, like she was beckoning me. No words, but the gesture was clear. In that moment, I moved toward them, almost in a trance. It was like something in me had latched on, like some higher force was pulling my hands and feet. But, just a few seconds later, everything stopped. The women retreated, silently, like shadows disappearing into the night. They stood there, unmoving, and it felt like they had never been there at all. The light in the yard was the same. The wind still whispered through the trees, and the raindrops fell in a rhythm I knew too well. I thought maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just too tired, my mind overwhelmed with fear and old stories. Maybe they were just two women walking past my house. Maybe there was nothing creepy about them. I closed the door, but everything inside me was still a mess. No sound, no steps, no movement. Maybe I was just too scared, I thought. Maybe they really had left. Maybe they were gone. But then, a few minutes later, I heard footsteps. And I knew they hadn't gone. It was the same sound, that familiar, quiet creak of the ground beneath their feet. Like they were standing right outside my door. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, my heart in my throat. Was I imagining it? Was I just making it up again? Through the gate, through the little gap between the wooden panels, I saw them. Even though they had moved back, they were now just a few steps away from my yard. Their long coats swayed with the wind, but their legs, those legs, they were there, unnaturally long and twisted, with black, leathery textures that twisted where human legs shouldn't be. Their legs were like something out of a nightmare, bulky, covered in tough, rough skin that looked like old, burnt branches. But the worst part? Their feet. Instead of human toes, they had crooked, messy hooves that glimmered in the moonlight. It was like their feet were made to twist in different directions, and their walk had this unsettling, almost cruel balance to it. They weren't exactly like goat legs in every way, but they were close enough. It was obvious. These women were not regular people. At that moment, one of them looked up. No words, but from their eyes, those deep, cold eyes, I could clearly read one question. Why did you stay? It was like time froze, and the wind became silent. My thoughts were a mess. I tried to remember everything I knew about these creatures, the myths and stories I had heard from the older folks. There were always tales of women with goat legs, coming from the darkness, waiting, but I never thought I'd be their next target. I tried to move, to get back inside, but something kept me there. Maybe it was fear, or maybe some inexplicable curiosity. There was no turning back. A few moments later, the second woman shifted her foot. There was still no sound, but that movement was enough to make me feel like the world around me was shifting once again. My hands were sweaty, my heart was racing. Maybe they were just watching me, waiting for me to realize that I hadn't run away. Is this real? Are they really standing here, at my door? What do they want? I glanced at them again, but now something was different. Their feet moved, slowly, as if they were aware I was watching. The women began retreating into the shadows. Slowly, they vanished into the darkness, and I felt like they were watching me for one last time, waiting for something, maybe testing my reaction. The ground was still. The sound of their steps had faded into the night, and the wind began rustling through the trees again. My heart was in my throat, and the entire world seemed to fall into a dead silence. Maybe they had just scared me. Maybe I was just too tired and frightened, and I had imagined it all. Maybe they were just strange women who happened to pass by in the midnight dark. But there was something in my stomach, that chill that gripped me, that wouldn't let me rest. Could those really have been the women from the stories? Is it possible they were actually here, at my door, just watching me? Or was it just a trick of my mind, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense? And as I stood by the door, staring into the dark, I felt something terrible. What did their visit mean? Or was it just a warning? Maybe they were just shadows, and I had become part of something I couldn't understand. I never found out the real truth about them. I never wanted to. My heart wasn't brave enough to seek them out again. But I know they were real. They weren't just a story.